Yeah, but you can break yourself.
You are not wrong. Okay.
I know these things.
My name is Brendan Hickey. I am an associate professor in the School of Environment here at Trent, and I have been here 31 years and a bit.
The week I started working at Trent was the same week people were first moving into the Environmental Science Center. The building had just opened.
My favorite research projects actually started right after I finished my PhD. A government scientist that I had known for a number of years as a graduate student took me on as a postdoctoral fellow with Department of Fisheries and Oceans. And it was a really interesting transition because I went from doing toxicological studies on small fish in a lab setting to try and figure out and get an understanding of why the St. Lawrence beluga population had such high contaminant levels. That project didn't have much hands-on work. It was mainly computer modeling, which has become sort of the main focus of my research over the last 30 years. And when I started that project, the federal government was also starting a program looking at contaminants in the Canadian Arctic. And I sort of got into that on the ground floor and had funding related to Arctic contaminants for close to 25 years. And that enabled me to do several trips to the Arctic to help it with field sampling. That was a real adventure, and that program had annual meetings, and there were some absolutely amazing scientists that I got to interact with. Perspective is always important, and having access to and listening to diverse views and I've also come to realize along the way that some of the scientists that I've gained the greatest respect for, retired professor, came from really diverse backgrounds. Who was here at Trent for a bunch of years. I first got to know him as a grad student. His background was in chemical engineering, and when he was first hired at the University of Toronto, he was in the chemical engineering department. And the connection he made with people working in environmental science at U of T turned him on to the idea that his skills in chemical engineering, which was like cracking hydrocarbon molecules in industrial settings, some of the understanding from that actually applies to how chemicals behave in the environment. So you can bring different skill sets, and you also learn that working with people with different skill sets is incredibly valuable. You may not use or interact really directly in projects, but the perspective, the work that I was doing, which was is really valuable of how chemicals accumulate in animals and applying it to a group of species that nobody had ever looked at from that perspective before. I can add one more thing to that previous answer. One thing that has really helped with my research on marine mammals is, say for example, in the program looking at Arctic contaminants, I interacted with several scientists whose main skill set is they're environmental chemists. So they get tissue samples provided by Inuit hunters, and they measure concentrations of contaminants in the animals. They can relate them to the age and sex and species. And it's very expensive analysis. And what I do with the modeling work is inexpensive by comparison. And so One argument we've always made to support the kind of stuff I do is it is value-added research, that I can take a really costly data set and tease more information and understanding from it for not very much money. And that's been a real selling point in the kind of work I do.
Okay.
Money is always an issue. You know, one thing I tell people about my work is university professors have tremendous freedom in terms of the kind of research we do, so long as we can support it. Some work like the microplastic stuff doesn't really cost money, it's just time. Other kinds of research requires money, and yeah, you can do it if you can get the financial support. Yeah, yeah. You know, funding for science, government agencies respond to concerns that get out there and that people are talking about and asking about and are, you know, in the forefront of the media. Government gets asked, well, what are you doing about it? And they have to respond. So, you know, they're very sensitive to those kinds of things. And when they do come in the forefront, there are certainly good questions. I'm not saying that microplastics are not a problem in any way. Just the particular kind of aspect regarding affecting other chemicals in the environment, I saw as being hype. But there are lots of concerns with microplastics.
Okay.
Funding is always a challenge, and so there's different types of funding. For example, the Canadian federal government gives what's called discovery grants. It's increasingly competitive to get funding from them for a variety of reasons, some of which is internal politics in the scientific community, that the big name scientists believe that they deserve more and more funding. And when there's only a certain amount of funding, people that are still doing good quality research but not running large research labs, so not putting out large numbers of publications, tend to be the ones that suffer. And I know I fall into that end of the spectrum, partly because here at Trent I'm in a teaching intensive position, so I do more teaching. There's less expectation of research, so my research productivity is less. Nonetheless, I have high quality research, just not as much. So there's a shift towards favoring people that have a lot of output, not necessarily high quality. Not saying that they don't put out high quality stuff, but quantity is a bigger driver of getting certain types of funding than strictly quality. The two main things I'm working on, one is still related to marine mammals, and in fact I lectured on it a bit last night, is about using the kind of work I've done on how marine mammals accumulate contaminants, and applying that to developing environmental regulations for contaminants that include consideration of marine mammals. Because when a lot of regulations for chemicals like PCBs that biomagnify through food chains, the people doing that work didn't have the capacity to include marine mammals, and through my research with a number of colleagues, we showed that those environmental regulations did not afford adequate protection to marine mammals. And this has been rolling out over 15 years. And now the government has finally sort of thrown a bit of money our way to start rethinking some of these regulations that brings in marine mammal populations to environmental regulation. And coming back to your question, I would say people in certainly Eastern North America tend to think less about issues of water quantity and water quality. Certainly living in the Great Lakes Basin, we don't have a huge water supply issue. And the biggest thing that really comes up is, oh, don't water your lawn in the summer. It's not a hardship. But I follow all kinds of global environmental stories, many of them water related. So, droughts in the southwestern United States, for example, is a huge ongoing issue that doesn't just affect that region. It's affecting agricultural productivity, and in the winter months, a lot of our lettuce and the type comes from California. So that drought is ultimately affecting us, but we're removed from the immediate vision of a water supply issue. I also follow world news, so places like the Middle East.
So we've seen a rise in youth like climate activism, attempting to
droughts going on,
change environmental frameworks,
which produces conflicts between countries,
and rise in social media presence. And should people keep approaching it? Would you encourage them and students to keep approaching it the same way, or do you think activism would be more productive in other ways?
Friction between countries.
That is a great question about activism.
May share a water resource.
Has it changed in frequency of occurrence? I'm not sure it has. It's a matter of tradition. Is there an issue recent that they've often had, particularly young people, agreements get concerned very gravitate to. So when I was an undergrad and things get tough 20 years ago, the big environmental issue country in our part around short of water asking their government do something about it. The only thing they can do. So there was all kinds of info sessions, there were protests demanding action on acid rain, both here in Canada, Eastern Canada in particular, and parts of the States, demanding government action. And that action led to extensive research that provided the basis for taking action. And governments actually responded and brought in pretty good legislation to reduce emissions of acid-forming chemicals. Have we solved the problem completely? No, not yet, but the protests have died down because action was taken, and it's definitely moved in the right direction. Nowadays, protests on climate change, do they matter? Absolutely. How effective they are, that's always tough to tell. Small local actions, there was a protest downtown a week or two ago, and I was thinking, oh, maybe I should go join in. Got busy. I feel guilty. I am very impressed that students are taking an interest and stepping up to voice their views. Climate change is, unlike acid rain, is a very slow rolling environmental issue. It plays out over years and years and years.
think people are scared of water quality and water management? Why, and should they be?
Well, yeah, water is something that we all need on a daily basis. I think there are legitimate concerns. So over my time at Trent, I've seen a tremendous shift of students carrying around water bottles that they get filtered water in. They don't want to drink regular tap water. And that's out of concern about what's in the water. And in Peterborough, our municipal tap water, while it's safe to drink, you're very unlikely to get E. coli or other harmful pathogens in our municipal water supply. In fact, water supply Peterborough was never to a great extent about that. Even though water, but certainly taste quality is an issue, global issue. Tap water. It comes down to, and so people, what's happened? A lot of people have that sort of immediate day-to-day concern. So in the Great Lakes, you know, we can which look at, extends into Lake Ontario. I don't trust what's out. When I was here in the 1960s, they're not necessarily, and we've made tremendous about what the actual issues are over the last 40 years. Are they afraid? Some are. The problems we have now in the Great Lakes are not as easy to fix. I wouldn't say afraid, concerned, aware, not necessarily always fully aware of what the actual concerns are, but they're aware that, yeah, water quality matters, and without needing to know or wanting to know the details of why. In other parts of the world, you know, water quantity is an ever-increasing problem, and I draw that right back to a week or two ago in the news. There was a story out that the global population passed 8 billion people. And I sometimes bring that into some of my lectures. There's a lot more of us, and that puts higher demand on water resources for us, and we have to recognize that water resources are not just for people to take to irrigate agricultural fields. If you take all the water, then there's nothing left for fish, wildlife, aquatic birds, what have you. And in some parts of the world, human uses have led to destruction of aquatic ecosystems, simply because there's ever-growing populations, increasing demand to support people directly, but also for use in quite often growing crops that don't really belong in certain areas. Cotton, for example, is a crop that needs tremendous amounts of water, and yet it's being grown in places in the world where there simply isn't enough water to really support that long term. That, to me, is a direct connection to human population. Demand for cotton is increased because there's more people and more affluent people. Impoverished countries see that as an opportunity to grow more cotton, to feed the marketplace, to generate revenues, but it comes at the expense of water resources. In my early years, certainly as a grad student, I very often thought, you know, you can just sit there and do your research. And if you do good research, you're going to have a successful career. But it doesn't really work that way. There's a cycle between issues of concern that drive funding for research and research on environmental issues, whether it's water, air quality, what have you, has to feed into the understanding that enables governments to hopefully develop programs to address those issues. So